Hi, Mrs. Polachek here from Hinsdale South High School, giving you some updates in terms of the 2015 AP Psychology for Response. We're going to be going over how to write it using the SOTA method here, so space, order, define, apply. I went over how to use this in a previous video, and now I'm going to be going over how to write the 2015 exam for your response. I did grade this one. I graded over 2,000 essays of this, and so I do know quite a bit about this for your response. Do I know everything? The answer is no, I don't. However, like I said, I did read quite a few, so I'm able to tell you what would score and what would not. So the question basically is a stats question, which I predict will be on the 2020 for your response question or test. There will be a stats research methods question of some sort. So it says, researchers conducted a naturalistic study of children between the ages of 5 and 7 years old. The key word here is naturalistic study, okay? The researchers visited the classroom during class party celebrations. As a measure of hyperactivity, they recorded is another key word, the number of times the children left their seats. The researchers found a strong positive correlation. Again, this is key right here. It is not an experiment because of the strong positive correlation between sugary snacks offered at the parties and hyperactivity. Based on these findings, the researchers concluded that the sugar causes hyperactivity. Again, causes should not be here because we talked about this is a strong positive correlation. Naturalistic study is not going to be an experiment, so it's going to be pointing to correlation. So again, the prompt already offers me clues as to what the issue is going to be here in the next part. Part A, how might the following explain why people may easily accept, and I would circle easily accept, the conclusion of the study described above? Confirmation bias, availability heuristic, and misunderstanding of correlational studies. Again, we kind of hinted at where the answer is for this. Part B, as a follow-up study, the researchers are designing an experiment. So the second part is talking about an experiment to test whether sugar causes hyperactivity. Again, causes hyperactivity. For the experiment, please do the following. State a possible hypothesis. This should be written as an if-then statement. Operationally define the dependent variable and describe how random assignment can be achieved. And lastly, based on the results of the follow-up experiment described in Part B, researchers concluded that sugar does not cause any change in hyperactivity. Draw a correctly labeled bar graph depicting this result. This is key here. Again, labeled bar graph. So this is actually 2 points right here. So what I have here is the next part is going to be the answer key. And this is what I had to look at before I graded the different essays. So the first part, okay, is confirmation bias. Students' response must indicate that a person may easily accept the conclusion of the study if the conclusion supports their previously held beliefs. Then they expect that it's going to cause that. Okay. Again, people pay attention to the results. A lot of people talk about researcher bias or hindsight bias. I knew it all along. That does not score, so be very careful there. Point 2, availability heuristic. Availability heuristic has to do with memory, something that pops into my mind, something that's vivid and it's distinct. If it doesn't talk about pops into mind or it quickly comes into mind, it does not score. And they made that very clear when I was at the AP reading. That was something that was very clear. It had to be something that comes in quickly based on previous experience. Point 3, misunderstanding of correlational studies. This should be a shoe-in. Correlation does not imply causation. That's all you have to state here. Don't have to necessarily talk about anything more, and that should be an easy point. Point 4, what you need to say here, again, is a possible hypothesis. You could either have a null hypothesis, something like sugar has no effect on hyperactivity, and that's fine. However, here's a trick. If you're going to say that sugar does have an effect, you have to say what you do with sugar. Is it increased, decreased, given, eaten? Something has to be done with sugar in order to get the point. They were very clear that you have to say that something is done with sugar. You have to, again, consume it, you have to eat it, you have to have candy bars, something like that in order to be able to get the point. It was very, very clear when we were grading it, that's what they wanted. Next. The next thing is operationally define the dependent variable. An operational definition, again, quantifies a variable. It tells us about the variable and how we're going to measure it. And specifically, you have to talk about, again, number of times a child gets out of the chair, time switching tasks, self-report scale, some sort of quantifiable indicator. You cannot just say hyperactivity. You have, again, have to say something about that hyperactivity. How do I measure it? Again, do not score general descriptions of activity, behavior, movement. It has to be something very, very specific. Next, point 6, describe how random assignment can be achieved. Again, random assignment is not the same as random sampling or representative sampling. Random assignment specifically has to do with, again, giving an equal chance of being placed into groups or conditions, specifically the control or the experimental group. Again, the key word, if you see equal chance, you could talk about a random number digit table, random number generator, something like that, drawing names out of a hat, but again, has to be by chance. And if you talk about random sampling, you do not get the point at all. Point 7. Point 7 and 8 were definitely very interesting, very easy to grade, but at the same time interesting because there were so many different ways that we saw people make graphs. I saw scatter plots, I saw wiggly lines. You'd be very surprised by what I saw on this AP exam. So to get to point 7, you had to label on the y-axis hyperactivity, or a measurement of hyperactivity, like getting out of the seats, number of times getting out of the seat, that would count. And sugar, or amount of sugar. And that was what you got for the first point, point number 7. Point number 8, they had to be equal, that there was relatively the same length. They had because you're showing that there was no difference between the two groups in the experiment. There was no statistical difference, so they should be equal. Note, whenever you have to draw a graph on a test, you want to make sure that it's simple. I saw people draw 5, 6, 7 lines. More lines does not make it more accurate. So what you need to do is have them be somewhat equal, okay? Some people draw whisker bars. You don't need the whisker bars, okay? Again, simple is what we want. They should have been equal or close to it, okay? If it was going to be something that was a significant difference, the bar should be very, very tall for the experimental group and shorter for the control or placebo group. And again, a lot of people lost out on a very easy point because they did not draw just 2 bars. If they had 3, 4, 5, 6 bars, they lost out. And so again, don't lose out on it by drawing more. So what we're going to look at here are some samples that have been released by the College Board of specific exams. So what we're going to do is go over of students' samples and then grade them together. So first one says, after any scientific study, there is potential for confirmation bias. Confirmation bias states that after research is conducted, people believe they knew it all along. That is wrong because it's talking about the hindsight bias. Knew it all along is a hindsight bias that would not score. This would cause people to easily accept the conclusion of the researchers. That is wrong. Availability heuristic is when thinking of possible solutions or answers to a question, ideas most immediately thought are used. This would score because it talks about immediately popping into my head. That would score. For example, and this is great, they give an example. If someone had recently given their child a sugary donut and that child became antsy, they would have thought popped into their mind. Again, here's this key thing, popped into their mind. Parent's head after hearing the study, he or she would most likely believe it. That's true. All right, so point there. A misunderstanding of correlational studies also contribute to widespread acceptance of researchers' conclusion. Many believe that correlation means causation, but this is not true. That would score. Many may believe that the correlation between sugary foods and hyperactivity shows that sugar causes hyperactivity, but there could be several confounding variables associated with the correlation. Again, they got the point up here. This is not wrong. It's just additional information we don't need. And that's why sometimes writing more is not always better. Next, the researchers should do a follow-up experiment to test their conclusion. A possible hypothesis could be if children consume sugary snacks, then they, and the research, cut it again, then they will be hyperactive. The dependent variable would be the level of activity of the students measured by the number of times they left their seats. Okay, so let's go back up here. Hypothesis, they would get the point here because it talks about consuming. That's the key word here. They have to talk about something they do with consuming. Dependent variable, they would get the point here because they talk about, again, something they do with sugar, left their seats. Okay, they left their seats, they got up. It wasn't just talking about hyperactivity very vaguely. Next, to properly measure the hypothesis, the independent variable would have to be whether or not the class had sugary snacks. In this case, random assignment could be achieved by ordering the first grade students at an elementary school by their last names, then using a random number generator to choose half of the students to be part of the control with no sugary snacks and the other half with sugary snacks. This would score here because it's the random number generator. Lastly, the graph. They have level of hyperactivity with number of times they left the seat. Again, you could have either or, you don't have to have both here. And then they have the control, and then they have the class with sugary snacks, and they're relatively even. They would get both 7 and 8. So this first free response was relatively short, concise, to the point. They got 7 out of 8 points. Next, the next free response, let's look through this. There are several things that may affect why people will accept the research or not. Confirmation bias can lead people to think that just because there is data to back something up, it must be true. They wouldn't get the point for this. They were not talking about finding information to support their belief. Next, availability heuristic can influence whether people accept the results too. Many people already know that sugar can cause kids to be more hyper, so their availability heuristic can mislead them. Many people might think that because there is a correlation between sugar and hyperactivity, that sugar must cause it, but correlation does not always mean causation. All right, so first thing here, first point does not score, does not give enough evidence that they know what that's confirmation bias is. Second point would score because they are talking about they already know, because they kids, okay? They already know, it kind of is already popping into their head. And the next point, correlation does not always mean causation, that does score. So they have the first, out of the first 3 points, they have point 2 and point 3. Next, a hypothesis for the experiment would be if children are given sugar, then they will be more hyperactive. Again, they're not talking about what hyperactive is. They're not talking about given sugar. Well, what do they do with sugar? Am I just holding it? They don't talk about eating it. They talk about consuming it. So increasing it or decreasing it. So given sugar is not enough. That would not score. To have a fair representation of the population, student will be picked at random from ages of 5 and 7. Again, that would not score because it's not talking about a random digit table. It's attempting to, but it's not talking about, again, a random way. And it's also talking about representation. That is not accurate as well. Lastly, they would get the last 2 points here because, again, equal bar graphs, okay, between sugar, given sugar and not. And then also they talk about the average amount of time they stood up. So, or how many times they stood up on that y-axis. So again, they would get the last 2 points. So this free response was a 4 out of 8, still a very good free response. If the average on this free response, I think, was around a 3. So if you got a 4 out of 8, you did very well. Lastly, okay. So confirmation bias is one prefers the other due to certain variables. The people might have easily accepted this because it is from a researcher. That is false. That has nothing to do, again, with confirmation bias. Availability heuristic is to make an assumption based on what's there. They only use sugar in the experiment, so they believe sugar is a cause. Nope, does not address the definition of what availability heuristic is. Correlational studies are how weak or strong data is. They don't see that other factors might have a role. Again, does not talk about causation, so that would not score. So they have a 0 out of 3 on the first part. Hypothesis is a theory about how something works before it is tested. The more sugar one has, the more hyperactive they are. And so they would actually score because they talk about more sugar, and it's talking about increasing. So they would get that point. Next, the dependent variable, they are correct here, that is the hyperactivity, but they're not talking specifically what the hyperactivity is. Are they getting out of their seat? Are they moving around more? They're not talking about how to specifically operationally define. So again, they correctly identify it as hyperactivity, but they're not talking about how to define it. So it is not correct. Random assignment is an experimental method where the participants are unknown. Putting the names of the students in a hat and drawing to see who participates is an example of this. And for this is not random assignments. They're not talking about groups. They're talking about just random sampling, and that is not going to score. Lastly, part C here. They actually, for this one, would get 1 point out of the 2 for the graph. They would get hyperactivity and amount of sugar, but look at this. They have 3 bars and they are differing lengths. In order to get the point here, they have to be able to, for point number 8, have them equal. Again, this is a typical of what we saw. People thought that they had to draw more bars than needed. Again, if you are asked to draw a graph on a free response, please, please, please keep it simple. Make sure that you label it very clearly, and that will definitely give you more points. Lastly, I want to just mention that if you look at these various free responses, what you'll see here is that notice this person went in order and underlined the key words here. Even though they didn't score a lot of points, this was way easier to grade. I was able to correctly tell what part they're connecting to. When I went back up to the free response up here, again, they left spaces in between a lot of ideas, or at least the groups of A, B, and C, which was actually very good. This person talked about a hypothesis, and they talked about the dependent variable. They actually talked about which words they were defining, and I cannot stress enough that if you do not talk about which words you're talking about, or you do not mention them in order, this is going to impact your overall grade. This person, again, didn't necessarily leave the spaces. They did indent. So if you see here, they did indent the researchers, okay? But they also talked about the main terms, again, in the prompt. So again, it is helpful. It's not necessary, but it is helpful when we're reading to be able to see, especially if you have sloppy handwriting like confirmation bias, use those words, leave spaces. It helps you organize your information, helps the reader. I highly stress that. I wish you the best of luck on your upcoming AP exam, and if you have any questions, my email is epolacek@hinsdale86.org, EPOLACEK @Hinsdale, HINSDALE.org. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I wish you the best of luck.